One of the dangers of having been in church most of one's life and having read and studied the Bible and its stories over and again is that we can become all too familiar with them. And in so doing, miss the surprise factor which God has embedded in His Word. Jesus frequently addresses difficult issues with a story. Parables, we call them. Almost always in His stories, Jesus turns common assumptions and preconceptions on their end upside down. Jesus takes what in the day was commonly thought about holy things and godly people, and He shakes it up. And His words unsettled folks, obviously. So much so, they ended up asking for His execution. It was so-called godly people who demanded His execution. The Romans would probably have let Jesus go. But it was the respected religious leaders who thought Jesus to be dangerous, and they wanted Him silenced. Chief among their complaints, He eats with sinners. It was in response to those folks that Jesus tells a series of stories about being lost. And the one read today by Greg is perhaps the most familiar, the prodigal son. Even folks who rarely grace the doors of the church know this story, and most of us have lived this story, at least some parts of it. Wayward child, dutiful but resentful sibling, ridiculously bend over backwards, give too much away, taken advantage of parent. Anybody here not found yourself close to one of those characters at some point in your life? We know this story. We even have lived this story. So there's danger here that we will miss the surprise. We will smugly think we've got it all figured out. Barbara Brown Taylor, who teaches at a seminary just up the road in Decatur, Georgia, takes this slant on the story, and her perspective made me step back a moment. She says Jesus offended a lot of people with His table manners. He ignored the finger bowl by His plate. He ate whatever was put in front of Him. He thought nothing of sitting down to eat with filthy people whose lives declared their contempt for religion. People saw Jesus eating and they knew who He was. Someone who had lost all sense of what was right, who condoned sin by eating with sinners, and who might as well have spit in the faces of the good people who raised Him. In those days, sinners fell into 5 categories. People who did dirty things for a living, such as pig farmers and tax collectors. People who did immoral things, such as liars and adulterers. People who did not keep the law up to the standards of the religious authorities, which would include all of us. Samaritans and Gentiles. Those were the sinners. So she says, if I were putting together a sinner's table at the Huddle House, it might include an abortion doctor, a child molester, an arms dealer, a garbage collector, a young man with AIDS, a Laotian chicken plucker, a teenage crack addict, and an unmarried woman on welfare with 5 children by 3 different husbands. And she said, don't forget to put Jesus at the head of the table.
Amen.
asking the young man to hand him a roll, please, and offering the doctor a second cup of coffee before she goes back to work. Now, if that offends you even just a little, well, you're almost ready for what happens next. Because what happens next, she says, is that the local ministerial association comes into the restaurant and they sit down at a large table across from the sinners. The religious authorities all have good teeth and there's no dirt under their fingernails. And when their food comes, they hold hands to pray. They're all perfectly nice people, but they can hardly eat their hamburger steaks for staring at the strange crowd in the far booth. The chicken plucker's still wearing her white hairnet, and the garbage collector smells like spoiled meat, and the addict cannot seem to find his mouth with his spoon, but none of those is the heartbreaker. The heartbreaker is Jesus, sitting there as if everything were just fine. Doesn't he know what kind of message he is sending? Who is going to believe that he speaks for God if he does not keep better company than that? I saw the meeting, she said, and I knew who they were. Now, while this seems a different story from the one about the man with 2 sons, it is really not. The 15th chapter of Luke begins with this complaint about Jesus and his table manners. This fella welcomes sinners, and he eats with them, the religious authorities grumble. And everything that follows is Jesus' reply. Jesus seems to understand the man with 2 sons who cannot get his family to sit down at the same table together. For the younger son is so warped by his sense of unworthiness that he's prepared to eat the rest of his meals in the bunkhouse with the hired hands. And the older son is so inflated by his sense of entitlement that he will not eat with anyone who's not earned a place at the table. Both sons suffer from the illusion that they can be in relationship with their father without being related to each other. What is a father to do? What this father does is to prepare a meal for both of them and let them figure out what to do about each other. This is fairly easy for the younger son. He's so glad to be back at the table again, he's not about to cause trouble for his older brother or anyone else. It is more difficult for the older son, who isn't even told when dinner is ready. And by the time he shows up and he finds out who has come slithering home, he's convinced that he has been displaced. It is as if there were only 2 chairs at the table, as if no one father could love 2 such different sons. And in spite of the father's assurance that everything the old man has is his, the story ends so sadly, so tragically, with the older son standing in the yard while the father goes back inside to sit down with the sinner. The elder son cannot bring himself to go to the party. Now, any way you look at it, this is an alarming story. It's about hanging out with the wrong people. It's about throwing parties for losers and asking winners to foot the bill. It's about giving up the idea that we can love God and at the same time despise each other. We simply cannot, no matter how wrong any of us has been. The only way to work out our relationship with God is to work out our relationship with each other. I would like to share with you something I wrote 3 years ago to the churches I was serving at that time. If you would, think back to what you were doing on this very Sunday 3 years ago. I can tell you what was happening in this room on that Sunday 3 years ago. Nothing. It was an empty room. It was an empty building. There were no lights on, no heat or air conditioning. There were no people. Where were you? This is what I wrote 3 years ago. A few weeks back, I was gone from my churches here on Sunday. I was not on vacation. I was asked by Susan Leonard Ray, our district superintendent, to join her for Sunday worship at the Triune Mercy Center in Greenville. I cannot remember if I told you anything about Triune Mercy Center or not. If I have, and I'm repeating myself, well, I seem to be doing that more and more lately. A brief history. Triune Mercy Center was once Triune United Methodist Church, a long-standing Methodist church on the edge of downtown Greenville. And like many of our churches, as the neighborhood around Triune began to change, the congregation of the church became smaller and smaller, down to the point that this once thriving church of several hundred members was down to about eight active folks. Before they shuttered the doors and the windows, though, one of their pastors came up with the idea of serving a weekly soup supper to the legions of homeless folks who were right outside their doors. The church sits directly across the street from the Salvation Army's emergency shelter in Greenville. Well, the soup supper ministry grew, and with support of Buncombe Street United Methodist Church and many other churches in the area of a variety of denominations, not only did multiple ministries to and for the homeless sprout up in their location, but a new church community was born in that location. I had heard about Triune, and I went there that day with some assumptions. First, I assumed there would be a good number of prodigal sons and daughters there, people who, by virtue of life situations and poor choices, found themselves homeless and hopeless. I assumed addiction would be a big issue among their congregation. And indeed, there were a good number of folks there that morning from that station of life. The man we ate dinner across the table from on that day we visited had his head shaved, and he had a tattoo that started at the top of his head. It ran down the side of his face and down his neck, and I don't know how much further on down. And he said that he was recently out of prison, there for drugs. He was trying to get his life in a better place, and Triune and their staff were really helping him. I was expecting to meet folks like him on that Sunday. I was not expecting what a significant role folks in that station of life would play in leading the worship service that day, providing music and reading the scripture and offering prayers, and that the building would be filled with beautiful artwork done by persons in that station of life, all prodigals. Upon arrival in the parking lot of Triune that morning, when we first got out of the car, our district superintendent saw two gentlemen she knew, both nicely dressed, professional-looking gentlemen in their probably mid-60s. I was a little surprised to see them there, but Susan shared that it was quietly but widely known around Greenville that those two gentlemen were life partners. So I was not completely surprised to see them there. Very few church communities offer a welcoming environment to same-gender couples, and perhaps at Triune they had found that environment. Now, in some people's judgment, two more prodigals. Once inside the sanctuary, besides the homeless who I was expecting to see there that day, I saw college students, most of them from Furman, and Susan greeted another acquaintance of hers, a woman who she said teaches psychology at Furman University. Again, a little surprising to see them there, but not completely surprising. College students and psychology professors are often seeking out-of-the-box experiences. It was after the service ended, milling around and talking to folks, that Susan ran into a family that she knew. A husband and a wife, their two children, probably 12 and 9 years of age. Susan was surprised to see them there. Susan knew them because she had once been their pastor at Advent United Methodist Church in Simpsonville. Susan came to us as our district superintendent here in Anderson after 9 years at that church. Advent Church is a thriving, growing church, and under Susan's leadership, the church quadrupled in size. Simpsonville, as if you know about this area, is a growing area with many upwardly mobile families, as sociologists call them, folks who are in the forward strides of their careers and are raising their families in neighborhoods with attractive homes and relatively safe streets. And Advent Church, because of their congregational growth, had to build bigger facilities and offer the full array of programs that appeal to young families. So what was this family from Advent doing at Tryon? Well, maybe they were just visiting on a Sunday to give their children a new cultural experience. No, that was not their story. No, they were now driving every Sunday from their home in Simpsonville to downtown Greenville to attend church at Tryon. Tryon is now their church home. Now, I don't know much else about their story, but from appearances, it looked like that they were elder sons and daughters who had decided to come to the party and bring their children. Doesn't happen very often. I was shocked. And worship that day at Tryon, about 200 folks in all, from all walks of life, worshiping together. It was a party. I cannot describe the joy in that room as God's children, black and white and Hispanic, young and old and middle-aged, single and married, straight and gay, financially comfortable and not a dime to their name, homeless and housed, all God's children celebrating as on that Sunday, two persons, once homeless and destitute, came to Jesus and they submitted to baptism at the hand of a female Baptist pastor. Oh, God does have a sense of humor. There was so much joy in that room, I wrote, that because I think folks who were once lost were now found, who were once blind were now beginning to see. This is what I wrote 3 years ago. I don't know where the wind of God's Spirit is going to take me, or you, or who He's going to bring into our lives, but I'm feeling a tug. I'm feeling a tug to follow Jesus. That is at the same time so exciting and so frightening. Pray for me. As I pray for you, I told my churches. That's what I wrote 3 years ago, this very Sunday. Well, here we are. Here we are, prodigals and elders all together at the same party. And in just a few moments, you're going to be invited to come and sit down and eat with sinners. And Jesus will be there at the table.
Amen. Hallelujah.
I can assure you that. You know what I've learned in the past 3 years? Perhaps I knew it somewhat, but I've learned it more than I ever known before. That whenever I have sat down at the table on a Sunday, whether it was in the fellowship room down the hall here, or when I was eating Sunday dinner at home with my family, or when from time to time we were going out to Tucker's with church friends for the Sunday brunch, You know what I've learned? I was